The sound of Tommy's jaw breaking was horrible. My 8-year-old grandson fell down, blood coming from his mouth. The angry HOA woman had just punched a little boy. She didn't know I was a federal judge sitting right there watching. Now she would pay for hurting my grandson. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The yellow school bus was running 10 minutes late that Tuesday morning, creating the usual chaos at the Maple Grove bus stop. Parents stood in small groups, chatting while their children played nearby. The autumn air was crisp and colorful leaves danced in the gentle breeze. It should have been just another peaceful morning in our suburban neighborhood. I sat on the bench reading case files, preparing for a major federal trial that would start the following week. After 25 years as a federal judge, I had learned to use every spare moment productively. The bus stop was my quiet time, a chance to review documents while keeping an eye on my 8-year-old grandson Tommy. Tommy was visiting us for 2 weeks while his parents traveled to Europe for their anniversary. My wife Margaret and I had been thrilled to have him stay with us. He was a bright, energetic boy who loved soccer, video games, and making new friends wherever he went. "Grandpa, look what I found," Tommy called out, running over with a perfectly shaped acorn in his small hand. His backpack bounced against his shoulders as he moved, and his sneakers were already dirty from exploring the small patch of grass near the bus stop. "That's a beautiful acorn, Tommy," I said, closing my file folder to give him my full attention. "Maybe we can plant it in Grandma's garden when we get home." Tommy beamed with excitement. "Really? Can we? Will it grow into a big tree?" "It might take a very long time, but yes, it could grow into a mighty oak tree," I told him, ruffling his dark hair. "Just like you're growing into a strong young man." Other children had gathered around the bus stop, and Tommy naturally gravitated toward them. Within minutes he was part of an impromptu game of tag, laughing and running with kids he had just met. That was Tommy's gift, he could make friends anywhere. I watched him play while reviewing my notes, smiling at his infectious laughter. The other parents seemed equally charmed by the new boy who had joined their morning routine. Tommy had that effect on people, he brought joy wherever he went. That peace was shattered when Margaret Hayes appeared. At 58, Margaret Hayes was the self-appointed queen of Maple Grove Estates. As president of the Homeowners Association, she had turned what should have been a simple community organization into her personal empire. She ruled with an iron fist, issuing fines for the smallest infractions and making life miserable for anyone who dared to question her authority. I had heard about Mrs. Hayes from my neighbors, but I had never encountered her personally. My house was in perfect condition, my lawn was immaculate, and I followed every rule in the HOA handbook. I had no reason to interact with her, and frankly, I preferred it that way. But Mrs. Hayes wasn't at the bus stop that morning because of HOA business. She was there because of rage. "Tommy Chen," she screamed, her voice cutting through the morning air like a knife. "Get away from that tree right now." I looked up from my files to see Mrs. Hayes marching toward the group of children with fury written across her face. She was impeccably dressed in a navy blue pantsuit, her gray hair perfectly styled, but her expression was twisted with anger. Tommy and the other children had been playing near a large oak tree that provided shade for the bus stop. They weren't damaging anything, just running around and having fun the way children do. But something about their presence had triggered Mrs. Hayes's wrath. "You're disturbing the mulch," she continued screaming. "That landscaping cost the HOA $12,000, and you little brats are ruining it." Tommy stopped running and looked confused. At 8 years old, he didn't understand what mulch was or why playing near a tree would be a problem. He looked around nervously, unsure what he had done wrong. "Ma'am," said Lisa Rodriguez, the mother of one of the other children, "they're just playing. They're not hurting anything. Don't tell me what they're doing." Mrs. Hayes snapped. "I can see perfectly well what's happening. These children are destroying community property, and I won't stand for it." I stood up from the bench, my protective instincts kicking in. Something about Mrs. Hayes's tone and body language set off alarm bells in my mind. In my years on the federal bench, I had seen enough unstable people to recognize the signs of someone who was about to lose control. "Tommy," I called out, "come over here, please." But Mrs. Hayes was already moving toward my grandson, her face red with anger. "You," she pointed directly at Tommy. "You're not even from this neighborhood. You don't belong here." Tommy took a step backward, clearly frightened by the woman's aggressive tone. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't know I was doing anything wrong." "Don't lie to me," Mrs. Hayes screamed, getting closer to Tommy. "I saw you kicking at the tree roots. I saw you throwing mulch." "I wasn't throwing mulch," Tommy said, his voice beginning to shake. I was just playing tag. Are you calling me a liar? Mrs. Hayes demanded, now standing directly in front of my grandson. Her hands were clenched into fists and I could see the veins bulging in her neck. I started walking quickly toward them, my heart racing. Mrs. Hayes, please step away from my grandson. Your grandson? She whirled around to face me, her eyes blazing with fury. Are you the one responsible for this little delinquent? Tommy is 8 years old and he was playing quietly with the other children, I said firmly. There's no need for this confrontation. No need. Mrs. Hayes laughed bitterly. Your grandson and his little friends have been destroying community property. That mulch bed represents months of planning and thousands of dollars in investment. I looked at the area around the tree. The mulch was perfectly intact. A few pieces had been displaced by small feet, but there was no damage whatsoever. Mrs. Hayes was creating a crisis where none existed. Ma'am, I don't see any damage, I said calmly. The children were simply playing. Perhaps we could all take a deep breath and— Don't patronize me, she interrupted. I know destruction when I see it. I've been protecting this neighborhood for 15 years, and I won't let some visiting brat ruin everything we've built. The other parents had gathered around now, forming a protective circle around the children. Everyone could sense that something was very wrong with Mrs. Hayes. Her anger was completely disproportionate to the situation. Mrs. Hayes, said David Park, whose daughter Sophie was in Tommy's class, maybe we should all calm down. The bus will be here soon, and the children need to be ready. Calm down? Mrs. Hayes shrieked. I'll calm down when these children learn to respect community property. I'll calm down when parents stop raising little vandals who think they can destroy anything they want. Tommy was now visibly upset, tears forming in his eyes. Grandpa, I really wasn't trying to hurt anything, he said, his voice breaking. I know you weren't, Tommy, I said gently. You did nothing wrong. But Mrs. Hayes wasn't finished. Nothing wrong? Nothing wrong? Her voice rose to a scream. Look at this mulch. Look at what your precious grandson has done. She gestured wildly at the tree area, pointing at mulch that looked exactly as it should. Her rage was completely irrational, and I began to worry about everyone's safety. Mrs. Hayes, I think you should leave, I said firmly. You're frightening the children. I'll leave when I'm ready to leave, she snarled. This is my neighborhood. I've worked for 15 years to make this place perfect, and I won't let anyone destroy it. That's when she turned back to Tommy, her face twisted with fury. You little brat, she hissed. You think you can come into my neighborhood and destroy whatever you want? Please don't yell at me, Tommy whispered, backing away from her. I'm sorry if I did something wrong. Sorry isn't good enough. Mrs. Hayes screamed, and then she did something that changed everything. She grabbed Tommy by the shoulders and shook him violently. Maybe this will teach you to respect other people's property. Let go of him. I shouted, rushing forward. But Mrs. Hayes wasn't finished. In a moment of pure rage, she drew back her right hand and punched my 8-year-old grandson directly in the face. The sound of her fist connecting with Tommy's jaw was sickening, a dull crack that seemed to echo through the morning air. Tommy's head snapped back from the impact, and he crumpled to the ground, blood streaming from his mouth. Time seemed to stop. The other children screamed. Parents rushed forward. Mrs. Hayes stood over my fallen grandson, her chest heaving with exertion, her fist still clenched. Tommy. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands shaking as I checked his injuries. His jaw was clearly broken. I could see the unnatural angle and the swelling that was already beginning. Blood poured from his mouth where his teeth had cut his lip. Grandpa, Tommy whispered through his broken jaw, his voice barely audible. It hurts so much. I know, sweetheart, I said, pulling out my phone to call 911. Help is coming. You're going to be okay. Mrs. Hayes stood frozen, staring down at what she had done. For a moment, her rage seemed to evaporate, replaced by shock at her own actions. But then her anger returned, and she began trying to justify what had happened. He was destroying community property, she declared to the horrified parents. Someone had to teach him a lesson. His grandfather wasn't controlling him. You punched a child. Lisa Rodriguez screamed. You broke an 8-year-old's jaw. He needed to learn respect. Mrs. Hayes shot back. I've spent 15 years protecting this neighborhood, and I won't let anyone destroy it. David Park was already on his phone with the police. Yes, we need officers at the Maple Grove bus stop immediately. A woman just assaulted a child. The child needs an ambulance, his jaw appears to be broken. I knelt beside Tommy, trying to keep him calm while we waited for help. His face was swelling rapidly, and he was having trouble speaking because of his broken jaw. Tears streamed down his cheeks, mixing with the blood from his mouth. "Why did she hit me, Grandpa?" he managed to whisper. "I wasn't trying to be bad." "You weren't bad at all, Tommy," I said, my own voice shaking with emotion. "Sometimes adults do terrible things when they're angry. But this wasn't your fault." Mrs. Hayes continued her tirade, seemingly oblivious to the fact that she had just committed a serious crime. That boy needed discipline. His grandfather was letting him run wild. Someone had to take action. "You committed assault and battery against a minor?" I said quietly, looking up at her from where I knelt beside Tommy. "You're going to prison for this." "Prison?" Mrs. Hayes laughed hysterically. "I'm a pillar of this community. I'm the HOA president. I was protecting neighborhood property." "You punched an 8-year-old child in the face," I said, my voice growing harder. "You broke his jaw because you were angry about mulch that wasn't even damaged." The ambulance arrived within 5 minutes, followed closely by 2 police cars. The EMTs immediately began treating Tommy, carefully immobilizing his jaw and preparing him for transport to the hospital. "Sir, are you the child's guardian?" one of the EMTs asked. "I'm his grandfather and legal guardian while his parents are out of the country," I replied. "I'm also Federal Judge Robert Chin." The EMT's eyes widened slightly. "Judge Chin, we're going to take excellent care of your grandson. This appears to be a clean fracture of the mandible. It's serious but very treatable." Meanwhile, the police officers were taking statements from the witnesses. Every parent at the bus stop had seen Mrs. Hayes assault Tommy, and they were all eager to tell their story. "She just went crazy," Lisa Rodriguez told Officer Martinez. "She was screaming about mulch and community property, and then she grabbed the little boy and punched him in the face. It was the most shocking thing I've ever seen." "The child wasn't doing anything wrong," David Park added. "He was just playing with the other kids. There was no damage to anything. She attacked him for no reason." When the officers approached Mrs. Hayes, she was still ranting about neighborhood protection and property values. She seemed genuinely unable to understand why everyone was treating her like a criminal. "Officers, I'm Margaret Hayes, president of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association," she announced importantly. "I was protecting community property from vandalism. That boy and his friends were destroying our landscaping." "Ma'am, witnesses say you punched an 8-year-old child," Officer Martinez said. "I disciplined a child who was destroying community property," Mrs. Hayes corrected. "That's part of my responsibility as HOA president." "Ma'am, you don't have the authority to physically discipline other people's children," the officer explained. "You're under arrest for assault and battery of a minor." "This is ridiculous," Mrs. Hayes protested as the handcuffs were placed on her wrists. "I was protecting the neighborhood. I've served this community for 15 years. You can't arrest me for doing my job." "Your job doesn't include punching children," Officer Martinez said firmly. "You have the right to remain silent." As Mrs. Hayes was read her rights and placed in the back of the patrol car, I rode with Tommy in the ambulance to Children's Hospital. He was conscious but in significant pain, and the EMTs had given him medication to help manage it. "Am I going to be okay, Grandpa?" Tommy asked through his broken jaw. "You're going to be fine," I assured him. "The doctors are going to fix your jaw and you'll be good as new." But inside I was furious. As a federal judge, I had seen countless cases of violence and abuse, but this felt different. This was personal. Someone had attacked my innocent grandson for no reason other than their own twisted need for control. At the hospital, Tommy was immediately taken into surgery. The oral surgeon, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, explained that the fracture was severe but reparable. Tommy would need his jaw wired shut for 6 weeks while it healed. "The good news is that children heal quickly," Dr. Walsh told me. "With proper treatment, your grandson should make a full recovery. There shouldn't be any permanent damage." While Tommy was in surgery, I called his parents in Paris. Telling my daughter that her son had been assaulted by a neighbor was one of the hardest conversations of my life. "What do you mean someone broke his jaw?" Sarah cried. "Who would hurt Tommy? He's the sweetest boy in the world." "A woman from the HOA lost her temper over something completely trivial," I explained. "Tommy wasn't doing anything wrong. She just attacked him." "We're coming home immediately," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Cancel the rest of the trip. We need to be with our son." After hanging up, I sat in the hospital waiting room thinking about what I had witnessed. Margaret Hayes had committed a serious crime in front of multiple witnesses, including a federal judge. She seemed to believe that her position in the HOA gave her some kind of authority over neighborhood children. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The surgery took 3 hours. When Tommy woke up, his jaw was wired shut, and he could only communicate through gestures and whispered words. But he was alert and responsive, and the doctors were optimistic about his recovery. "Hey there, tough guy," I said, taking his small hand in mine. "How are you feeling?" Tommy tried to speak but winced in pain. Instead, he squeezed my hand and nodded to let me know he was okay. Over the next few days, as Tommy began his recovery, I learned more about Margaret Hayes and her reign of terror in Maple Grove Estates. She had been HOA president for 15 years, during which time she had made life miserable for countless families. Mrs. Rodriguez told me about how Margaret had fined her family repeatedly for excessive noise when her children played in their own backyard. The Martinez family had been threatened with liens for having the wrong color mailbox. The Johnsons had been forced to remove a small playground set from their yard because it violated aesthetic standards. "She's been a dictator," David Park explained. "People are afraid to cross her because she has so much power in the HOA. She can make your life hell with fines and violations." "Well, she won't be making anyone's life hell anymore," I said grimly. Margaret Hayes had made the mistake of assaulting a child in front of a federal judge. She was about to discover that there were consequences for her actions that extended far beyond anything the HOA could impose. The criminal charges were filed within 24 hours. Margaret was charged with assault and battery of a minor, child abuse and reckless endangerment. Her bail was set at $100,000, which she paid through a bail bondsman, using her house as collateral. But the criminal charges were just the beginning. I hired the best civil rights attorney in the state to file a federal lawsuit against Margaret Hayes and the Maple Grove HOA. The lawsuit alleged that Margaret had used her position of authority to systematically harass and intimidate families, creating a pattern of civil rights violations. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of Margaret's abuse of power. Over 15 years, she had issued more than 2,000 violations to homeowners, generating over $500,000 in fines. The vast majority of these violations were for trivial matters that had no impact on property values or community safety. More disturbing was the pattern of discrimination in her enforcement. Minority families were cited at 3 times the rate of white families for identical violations. Single mothers were targeted for harassment. Elderly residents were intimidated into compliance through threats of legal action. Margaret Hayes had turned the HOA into her personal kingdom, where she could play God with people's lives while hiding behind the pretense of community standards. The media attention was intense. HOA President breaks child's jaw over mulch became a national story. Margaret's picture appeared on news websites and social media, where she was universally condemned as a child abuser and neighborhood tyrant. The story resonated with people across the country who had their own experiences with overzealous HOA officials. Support poured in from families who had been victimized by similar abuses of power in their own communities. Margaret tried to control the narrative by giving interviews to local news stations. In every interview, she insisted that she had been protecting community property and that her actions were justified. "I've devoted 15 years of my life to maintaining the standards that make Maple Grove a desirable place to live," she told Channel 7 News. "That boy and his friends were destroying landscaping that cost thousands of dollars. Someone had to take action." When the reporter asked why she thought punching an 8-year-old was appropriate action, Margaret became defensive. "I barely touched him," she claimed. "Children today are too soft. A little discipline never hurt anyone. When I was growing up, adults had authority and children respected it." The interview went viral, but not in the way Margaret had hoped. Viewers were horrified by her complete lack of remorse and her attempt to justify child abuse. The comments section filled with thousands of people expressing outrage at her attitudes. Meanwhile, Tommy was slowly recovering. His jaw was healing properly, but the emotional trauma was taking longer to address. He had nightmares about the attack and was afraid to play outside. The carefree boy who had made friends easily was now anxious and withdrawn. "Why did she hurt me, Grandpa?" he asked one evening as I helped him with his liquid dinner. "I wasn't trying to be bad. Some people have problems in their minds that make them do terrible things," I explained. "Mrs. Hayes has spent so many years being angry and controlling that she forgot how to be kind. What she did to you was wrong and she's going to be punished for it." "Will she go to jail?" Tommy asked. "Yes," I said firmly. "She will definitely go to jail." The criminal trial began 6 months after the assault. Margaret had hired an expensive defense attorney who tried to argue that the attack was a momentary lapse in judgment by an otherwise upstanding citizen. "Mrs. Hayes has served her community faithfully for 15 years, her lawyer told the jury. She has no criminal record and has devoted her life to maintaining property values and community standards. This was an isolated incident caused by extreme stress and frustration. But the prosecution had video evidence from a nearby security camera that showed the entire assault. The jury watched in horror as Margaret grabbed Tommy and punched him in the face, then stood over his fallen body showing no remorse. More damaging was Margaret's own testimony. Under cross-examination, she continued to insist that her actions were justified. "That boy was destroying community property," she said from the witness stand. "As HOA president, I have a responsibility to protect our investments. Sometimes children need to be taught lessons that their parents won't teach them." "So you believe you had the right to punch an 8-year-old child?" the prosecutor asked. "I believe I had the right to protect community property from vandalism," Margaret replied stubbornly. "Even though no property was actually damaged? The potential for damage was there. I could see what was happening. What you saw was children playing near a tree. What gave you the right to assault one of those children?" 15 years of faithful service to this community," Margaret answered, her voice rising. 15 years of protecting property values and maintaining standards while everyone else just wanted to let things slide. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. Margaret was sentenced to 2 years in state prison and ordered to pay $250,000 in restitution for Tommy's medical expenses and pain and suffering. But the criminal conviction was only part of Margaret's downfall. The federal civil rights lawsuit revealed the full extent of her corruption and abuse of power. The investigation uncovered evidence that Margaret had been embezzling money from the HOA for years, using community funds to pay for personal expenses. She had also been taking kickbacks from contractors who worked in the neighborhood, inflating the costs of community projects and pocketing the difference. The $12,000 landscaping project she had been so angry about protecting had actually cost only $4,000, with Margaret stealing the rest. More shocking was the discovery of Margaret's secret surveillance operation. She had installed hidden cameras around the neighborhood to spy on residents, collecting information she could use to harass and intimidate them. She had recorded private conversations, photographed personal activities, and maintained detailed files on every family in the community. The FBI became involved when the surveillance operation was revealed. Margaret was charged with additional federal crimes including wire fraud, conspiracy, and violation of privacy rights. During the federal trial, dozens of families testified about Margaret's harassment and intimidation. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had used her position of authority to terrorize an entire community while enriching herself through various criminal schemes. Mrs. Rodriguez testified about how Margaret had threatened to have her children taken away by social services if she didn't pay inflated fines for noise violations. The Martinez family described how Margaret had tried to force them to sell their house by making their lives unbearable with constant citations and harassment. "She was like a dictator," David Park testified. "She controlled every aspect of our lives. We were afraid to make any changes to our property, afraid to have friends over, afraid to let our children play outside. She had turned our neighborhood into a prison." The federal jury found Margaret guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to an additional 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay over $2 million in restitution to the families she had victimized. But perhaps the most satisfying part of Margaret's downfall was watching her lose everything she had worked to build. The HOA was dissolved and replaced with a new organization that operated under strict oversight from the county government. The new board immediately rescinded all of Margaret's arbitrary rules and refunded thousands of dollars in illegal fines. Margaret's house was seized to pay restitution to her victims. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her pension was revoked. The woman who had lived in luxury while terrorizing her neighbors was left with nothing. More importantly, her reputation was completely destroyed. Margaret Hayes became a national symbol of HOA abuse and corruption. Her story was featured in documentaries about neighborhood tyranny and used as a cautionary tale in law schools and community management courses. She received thousands of hate mail letters from around the country. Death threats poured in from people who had heard about what she did to Tommy. Her few remaining friends abandoned her, and her family disowned her publicly. Margaret appealed her convictions multiple times, but every appeal was denied. She would spend the next 10 years of her life in prison, and when she was finally released she would be a broken, penniless old woman with nowhere to go. Tommy made a full physical recovery from his injuries. His jaw healed perfectly, leaving no permanent damage. But the emotional scars took longer to fade. With the help of therapy and the support of his family, Tommy gradually regained his confidence. He learned that not all adults were dangerous and that the world was generally a safe place for children. But he never forgot what Margaret Hayes had done to him. On the day Margaret was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, Tommy was in the courtroom with his parents and me. He watched quietly as the woman who had attacked him was led away in handcuffs. "Is she going to stay in jail for a long time, Grandpa?" he asked as we left the courthouse. "Yes, Tommy," I said. "She's going to be in jail for a very long time. She'll never hurt another child." "Good," Tommy said simply. "Maybe now other kids won't be scared to play at the bus stop." As we walked to our car, I reflected on the events of the past year. Margaret Hayes had thought she could attack my grandson with impunity, believing that her position in the HOA made her untouchable. She had learned too late that there are some lines you don't cross, some people you don't attack, and some consequences you can't avoid. I had spent my career as a federal judge ensuring that justice was served for those who couldn't protect themselves. When someone attacked my own family, I made sure that justice was swift and complete. Margaret Hayes broke my grandson's jaw at a school bus stop, unaware that a federal judge was watching. Her moment of rage cost her everything: her freedom, her fortune, her reputation, and her future. She would spend the rest of her life paying for the few seconds of violence that destroyed a child's sense of safety. In the end, that's what justice looks like: complete, uncompromising, and final. Tommy is now 10 years old, happy and healthy, with no lasting effects from his attack. He plays soccer, gets excellent grades, and has friends throughout the neighborhood. The bus stop where he was assaulted is now a safe place where children play freely, without fear of being attacked for disturbing the mulch. Margaret Hayes sits in a federal prison cell, serving her sentence and thinking about the moment she decided to punch an 8-year-old boy. She lost everything because she couldn't control her anger, and she'll never have the chance to hurt another child. That's not revenge. That's justice.